All right, folks, so welcome aboard. I want to do this quickly so you can get your preparation for our big project over, okay? So, this video is for our day 2 of blood testing and how we're going to have different people effectively collect the blood and test it of your patient. So, it looks nice and big for the screen. All right, so of course, day 2 is blood testing. And we need to fill out the medical staff plan. And I believe your team already did that. This is the medical staff plan. And you have different people doing the phlebotomist job, lab technician job, data processor, and the attending nurse. They each have different roles. And this video is going to go over how they're going to do their job. So everything gets done and the manager can claim success for the team. All right, so let's keep moving. First job is phlebotomist. It's a hard word to say. The phlebotomist collects the blood samples. They're going to visit the patient station. So if you have patient 1, 2, 3, or 4, and they're going to collect blood samples, and the blood will be in these little microcentrifuge tubes. And the phlebotomist also needs to label each test tube. So there will be blood samples for the patient you're using. And you'll have a cup that is meant to measure blood glucose. You need to get a sample out of that cup. The phlebotomist needs to go to the station and get a blood sample for each of these containers. But that's not all. Once the phlebotomist for your team collects the blood samples and they get one out of each cup for your patient, they need to then label, just like it shows here, they need to label on the tube something that tells your team that this blood tube came from blood glucose, that this tube came from glucose 6-phosphate. This tube is meant to test fructose 1,6-biphosphate, and so on, because the tubes themselves are blank. It would be very uncertain to know where the tube came from unless your phlebotomist labels the test tube with a Sharpie, and I'll provide you with a Sharpie, okay? All right, so once the phlebotomist has collected all the blood samples from the correct station, from the correct patient station, once they have all the tubes, they need to make sure that all the tubes are labeled properly. My advice to you is take your Sharpie with you to the patient station, and every time you draw a a blood sample from the cup, you immediately, once you take it out of the cup, you then label it with the Sharpie on the tube, preferably on the cap. And this is the cap on the very top. The top of the cap is rough and it's easier to mark. You may be wondering and thinking of an easy way to do that. So as you label the test tubes, my advice might be, let's see if we can fast forward a little. Just be patient. You can see the blood glucose tube. I've numbered it 1 here. This one, glucose 6-phosphate, is number 2. So if you use the data table here and use the numbers, you don't have to write the whole word. You can just write a number on the test tube, and that will indicate what you're testing in that tube. So for example, number 5 is pyruvate. So instead of trying to write pyruvate on this tiny test tube, and again, you can see how small it is, it's a tiny surface. You could just write number 5 on this test tube instead of pyruvate. Blood glucose you could label as number 1 as it matches the table. All right, let's move forward. The next job is lab technician. The lab technician is the person who will actually take the blood out of the test tube and drop it onto the test paper. So they use the blood testing paper strips, like you see here. They look kind of goldish, and they'll drop one single drop on the paper, and then they will wait to identify the color. When dropping the blood onto the paper and when using the blood sample tubes, the lab technician should use the blood data test form. This is printed for you and it'll be available in the classroom. And for each square, you can put a piece of the test paper here. And for each square, you can use that paper there, this test strip, and the blood to represent each of the categories. And that is, each square can represent one of these test tubes. It looks like this. You could put blood glucose test tube here and the test strip right here. You could put pyruvate here for number 5, the test strip and the blood, and label it appropriately. So each of these boxes could be labeled for what you're testing for. So if you have a test tube here for blood glucose, you would write blood glucose, get your test strip, just like you see here, and make sure you have the correct little test tube of the blood. So you'd place the test tube in the box, the test strip, and you would label the box what it is. All right, moving on. Our next job is data processor. So let's move forward. Oh, sorry, 1 second. Lab technician, your job is to identify if the blood contains high, plus plus, positive, or negative levels. And this is just a guide to help you. If the test strip turns out, when you put a drop of blood on it, it turns out pink or red, or bright pink or red, that means you have low levels of whatever you're testing for in the blood. If the test strip comes out orange, that is a normal amount of whatever you're checking for in the blood. And if the test strip comes out dark, that means you have high levels of whatever you're testing for in the blood. Let's move on. So the data processor simply needs to take the results of the lab technician and put that data in the data table so you have it. And that looks like this as an example. So when you test blood glucose, if you find out blood glucose was bright pink, that means you have low levels of blood glucose. Let's say you were testing number 6 here, ATP. If you tested ATP and the test strip came out as orange, that means you have positive or normal amounts of ATP in the blood or in the cells of your patient. If you tested glucose here for muscle tissue, so you were looking at the glucose levels in the muscle cells, and you got, let's say, a bright pink, that would mean that the the glucose levels in the muscle cells was very low. So bright pink, you would write negative or low. If blood glucose levels were high, because the test strip was really dark, you would write positive, positive, or high levels. So the data processor completes and fills out the table based on the results of the test strips. The team will need to help the data processor because it can be hard to tell the difference between bright pink and orange sometimes, or it can be hard sometimes to tell the difference between red and orange. So if you want to get your results well, you need to make sure the whole team works together to help the data processor, because the data processor has to know if it's low, normal, or high levels. So as the data processor tries to write down the information, make sure the team is helping them record this into the data table. All right, the final role is attending nurse, and that just means they help all the staff. So if the phlebotomist needs help labeling the test tubes, then the nurse should go with them to do it. If somebody needs help organizing the blood data test form, the nurse should help do that. If the data processor is having a hard time filling out the data, the nurse can help them do that. So the nurse is just an all-around helper. They can help collect and label blood test tubes. They can help fill out the blood test form, whatever the team needs. Lastly, I just want to talk about the order that this staff plan will be completed in. The first teammate to work will be the phlebotomist. They're the ones who get the blood and collect the blood samples. They're going to be the first to go. The second person to do work will be the lab technician. So the first person to do work will be the phlebotomist. The second teammate to work will be the lab technician. The third job will be done by the data processor, and they really just need to look at the test strips and add the information, the data, the results into the table. So the phlebotomist works first, lab technician works second, and data processor is third. All right, that pretty much concludes our video.